there we go. Okay, so what I'm presenting today is still a work in progress. I have submitted the paper and it is under review, so hopefully something will come of it. But it's based on some work I did over the last year. At the end of my PhD, I was focused very much on expanding my research. So I'd done my PhD on artificial placentas or artificial womb technology. And I started thinking to myself that actually thinking about that technology in isolation didn't actually make a lot of sense when there were all sorts of other technological options sort of coming to the attention of the bioethics literature at the same time. And all of these things might be seen as alternatives to people who wanted to become a parent in different ways. And so I thought it might be useful to start thinking about ways to regulate these technologies together. I should say, as a caveat, I am a lawyer, so my interest came sort of very much as a question about regulation. But this project essentially was based on these ideas that for people who can't gestate, whether that's for biological, social or psychosocial reasons, assisted gestation could afford them the potential to become a biological parent in a myriad of ways, and novel technologies are changing the opportunities that are available to individuals. So this paper that I'm presenting actually results from an empirical research project where I sought the views of reproductive rights advocates about the benefits and limitations of different novel forms of assisted gestation. And I'll explain why I did that in a second. So in terms of what I take assisted gestation to be, these are new technologies or practices that are sought after as an alternative to surrogacy, but also on their own terms for the specific benefits that they offer. So I was focused specifically on uterus transplantation and ectogestation. So I'm sure I don't need to explain to this group what these technologies are, but I will just really briefly. Uterus transplantation presents the possibility of enabling those born without a uterus or potentially people who've had their uterus removed to gestate, and so they can experience pregnancy and birth. Since the first live birth was reported in 2014, there have been about 100 transplants performed worldwide. And it's got to the point now where people are starting to describe it not so much as an experimental technology, but more, an emerging therapy transitioning out of its experimental phase. Despite the fact it's becoming more routine, this is a surgery that's only been performed in people who were born with physiology assigned female. So there's never been an attempt to transplant a uterus into a person with physiology assigned male, though there are some reasons to believe that that is A, possible, and B, imminent with the recent news coming out of India. A more futuristic endeavour is the artificial placenta. So this is a device capable of gestating outside of the body. And there's been speculation about this possibility for a very long time, but that's really intensified in bioethics since 2017, when there were publications of successful animal prototype models in the United States, Western Australia, and Japan. These devices all have quite a similar design, but they're basically just designed to kind of do pretty much what a pregnancy does, but just without there being a pregnancy. So it emulates the function of a placenta. The technologies in their current iteration only have the capacity for what's called partial ectogestation. So that's taking over a gestation when a pregnancy potentially becomes dangerous or where a person no longer wants to be pregnant. But that still has quite a lot of choice enhancing potential that people are also interested in. So it has a way of maybe giving people a bit more control about how much gestation they want to do. I see these technologies as existing on a spectrum of options, much like there are an array of options about what kind of assisted conception you want. For example, if you don't produce your own eggs, there are still a multitude of ways in which you might be able to conceive, whether that's donor eggs, whether you want to try something like IVG. I see these technologies in a very similar way. They present people with options. Some people will want to gestate, some people won't. So there's a myriad thing here. There have been some critics of my idea of sort of clumping these things together, and they're very fair, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. But one of the main things that people want to talk about is distinguishing assisted gestation from alternative gestation. So, for example, somebody might allow me to do assisted gestation if they give me their uterus, but a artificial placenta, that's an alternative gestation because it doesn't involve my body, for example. I don't see those things as necessarily meaning that the possibilities are incommensurate to an individual. I still think that they might be, you know, ways in which somebody thinking about needing assisted gestation might consider these options as alternatives. Okay. So just as a background to the study, my sort of preliminary thinking was that these technologies raise distinct ethico, legal, social issues, and so need to be considered separate from assisted conception. And importantly, conceptual and practical conclusions about one technology. So when you decide a uterus transplant is permissible, for example, might impact on access to the artificial placenta. And so I thought thinking about those technologies together was useful. Another thing I'm often charged with is thinking about technologies that aren't routinely in existence, right? You know, people these days don't sit down and have a think about whether they're going to use an artificial placenta or a uterus donor in order to achieve their reproductive goals. But I believe quite firmly in the importance of speculation in bioethics. And I do believe this conversation about assisted gestation comes at a particularly good time in the UK, when we're in the middle of reforming our law about surrogacy. Or hopefully reforming our law about surrogacy. It means that people are quite attuned in public terms to the issues of assisted gestation. And so it makes for quite a good moment to start thinking about what those issues actually are. And I wanted to build very specifically on the work of Amel Algrani, who argued that regulatory change in 2008 that made some changes to how we do surrogacy was a missed opportunity because we didn't start thinking about uterus transplants and artificial placentas then. And my sort of thinking about her work is I agree, like I love speculative work, but I think the problem with the sort of criticism of that regulation was very much that it was about fertilization and embryology. And so we need to think about this technology as existing on a different plane and doing a different function. And so I wanted to look at a regulatory scheme that wasn't fertilization and embryology, but was specifically assisted gestation. So that's why I was interested in this idea of a regulatory scheme for these technologies. In terms of why I did empirical research with reproductive rights organisations, to my knowledge, there had been no empirical research conducted with reproductive rights advocates at all about their perspectives on novel forms of assisted gestation. And the reason why I thought these individuals were key was because they have an awareness of the different sorts of experiences that people who can't gestate for very different reasons. They have an awareness of what their needs might be. And they also have an awareness of sort of the experiences of people who have experienced difficulties during gestation and birth, as well as the political landscape. So they had both an awareness of politics and what was sort of going on behind the scenes, but also what people wanted without speaking to those individuals directly. And they had that sort of range of experience. So I thought their insights would be really invaluable in highlighting how individuals may want to access and use novel technologies, as well as some of the sort of legal, political challenges that might be faced in that sense. So I also thought that those really unique insights might be able to help generate some perspectives that really enrich normative work. Quickly, in terms of study design, firstly, all of this research was funded by the British Academy, but they had no say at all in the design of the study. I conducted 2 focus groups, each with 5 to 6 participants in June and July 2022, and they were each 2 hours. One was in person and one was online. That means there was a total of 11, and that does mean it is a very small sample size, right? And I do want to acknowledge that. But the fact that it doesn't have statistical generalizability because of a small sample size, I don't think limits its utility, because I think there's some analytical generalizability from the concepts that these individuals raise. And so they're still really useful in helping us to make sense of what's important in assisted reproduction. But also I managed to recruit from a variety of organisations, including some of those who were the most active in terms of campaigning about novel technologies, which I think means that the results still have some serious utility in terms of what my objectives were. How I recruited was very much through my own personal networks and my research in this area, but I did undertake some purposive sampling. So I wanted to get a range of views. And what I mean by that is that I recruited from some organizations that had a specific focus. So they were campaigners for fertility rights or for abortion or for birthing, for example. But then I also recruited from some organizations that were more sort of about a particular value in reproducing. So that meant, there was one that was really about promoting public understanding about reproduction, and there was another group that were really about promoting equality of opportunity in reproduction. And then I subjected my research to my data that was generated to reflexive thematic analysis. So I recorded my focus groups, had those transcribed, and then I went through and did inductive line-by-line coding and familiarized myself with the data, built a code tree, and then generated themes from what was really coming up quite a lot. I can talk about that process more if people are interested, but I'm going to skip to the good part. Okay, so there were more themes generated than the two I'm going to talk about. The two I'm going to talk about are what I see as the sort of preliminary foundation ones that came underneath everything else that was there, really. So the additional themes I'm going to talk about speak more to a law theme. So there was lots to say about parenthood. Sorry, Susan, I'm not going to do that now, but there was lots to say about parenthood and how we regulate that. There was lots to say about the value of regulating for technologies that don't yet exist. And those are really interesting observations. But before I got to those sorts of conversations or looking at those conversations, it was really these two themes that came out that were really important to explore. So the first was this idea of assisted gestation as having a quality enhancing potential. And the second was the potential limitations on that potential as a result of intersecting barriers. And what's really interesting to me is potentially the way I've labeled this is very consistent with the conversations that are going on in the literature at the moment. But the observations of my participants, I think, are very different to those conversations that are already being had. So in terms of equality enhancing potential, in both focus groups, there was a consensus that assisted gestation is important. There was a recognition that it's important to address reproductive health inequities by enabling people to reproduce in different ways that are attentive to their individual needs and preferences. That discussion was primarily focused on how assisted gestation has equality enhancing potential for communities and individuals within its capacity to enhance their privacy and dignity in reproducing. So sometimes that involved conversation about the benefits to individuals at a very individual level. So, what happens if a person feels really strongly that they want to experience a pregnancy and they're just not able to? And also, what happens if somebody's scared of being pregnant and giving birth, but they really want a biological child? So there was lots of discussion about those individual benefits. But what was really interesting was there's a real focus in the conversations about how technologies provide opportunities to facilitate feelings of inclusion among communities and individuals who can't gestate. So there was an importance placed on the technology facilitating diverse forms of family formation and creating or helping people create their families in ways that they thought might not necessarily be possible because of their sexuality or their biology. But the importance of that was recognized as something much broader and more impactful than that individual family being allowed to exist or to create themselves in the way that they thought was possible. So in the following exchange I'm going to show you, participants in my second focus group reflected on the benefits that assisted gestation and specifically increasing options afforded whole groups of people with marginalized identities, even individuals who decided never to make use of those possibilities. So participant 7 says, I think we're seeing technology as facilitating a very specific thing, as facilitating gestation. But I think there is actually the variety and increasing the variety of routes to parenthood that does something much more powerful and fundamental, which is it potentially makes people at the point they realize they can't carry, for whatever reason, it allows them to recognize that family life is still an option for them in the future. So I think we risk missing that out. This is not just a means to an end, it's actually potentially going to allow people earlier and more comfortably to be themselves. And the participant then goes on to discuss the fact that sometimes when people have a marginalized sexual identity, it can be very difficult for them to reconcile feelings of wanting to be a parent with that sexual identity. And then they go on to say, so it wasn't in my case, but if the necessity and the fundamentality of wanting to be a parent was the reason for my trauma, then having been more aware of the process of surrogacy, or in the future technology that can support that, it would have made a big chunk of my life a lot happier. And then the next participant said immediately off the back of this, to add to that, you reminded me of something where there may be a parallel. I think when gay marriage was introduced in Massachusetts, it lifted not just the kinds of outcomes for the people that got married, but it lifted the outcomes for the gay community as a whole. When you're looking at benefits, there's a broader benefit to all groups in society that might be able to benefit from assisted reproductive technologies, of knowing that they're there, and that levels their place in society. And I think that's difficult to quantify, but there's a statement in that. So in this exchange, participants are discussing the utility of technology in facilitating equality in a far more structural sense. The observations, I think, add a much more nuanced and enriching dimension to the existing literature, which tends to focus on those benefits to individuals, which obviously are important, but this structural sense is really meaningful as well. Considering people who do not think they have an immediate use for the technology, as well as those who would use it if it was available right now, illuminates to me pertinent issues of social justice and the intersection between individual reproduction and the inclusion of marginalized groups in society. When individuals feel excluded from activities that are deemed socially valuable as well as personally valuable, such as parenthood or even gestation, because of attributes that are personal to them, this affects not only how they feel about their families, but also how they feel about themselves, and much earlier in their lives than when they're actually trying to reproduce at that specific point in time. Technologies and practices that enable people to attain the ability in future to reproduce no matter their sexual orientation or no matter their biology can really change their perception of their identity and their self-worth, and also their perception of their social standing. And most importantly, I think it will affect the extent to which individuals feel that they have options affording them the same opportunities to experience meaningful opportunities to other people, that other people who gestate or can gestate have. So this idea of structural equality is something that has come up in the existing bioethical literature, but it's been very much focused on the equalizing potential of artificial placentas for women or people with female assigned biology. And that's focused very much on the arguments by Evie Kendall and Catherine McKay are focused really on the idea that these technologies mean that female people can become parents without being expected to undertake the gestational labor involved. And this technology would mean things like, men could gestate using a uterus transplant, or a machine could do it instead. There's also been quite a lot of critique of those suggestions, specifically in earlier work with Claire Horn, I made this argument, and Julia Cavallari's also made this argument as well. But essentially it's just that in saying that the technology is equalizing, it locates the inequality in the physiology to become pregnant rather than in the social response to those bodies. So obviously, I lean one side of that argument, but there hasn't been any exploration of the equality enhancing potential of knowing options are there. So this sort of mechanism, this substantive mechanism of equality enhancement for people who consider themselves to be a more marginalized community. And I feel like the observations of these participants elucidate those mechanisms and explain that these technologies are not simply a matter of helping people to build their families in different ways, but enabling people to plan their lives and their identities around that future possibility in different ways. In the literature, there's actually very little reflection about the benefits of these technologies for LGBTQ+ communities in general. You quite often see in lots of the writing about ectogestation that male same-sex couples are seen very much as a secondary beneficiary of the technology. So there's discussion about how it will, help or not help women, and then you have same-sex couples mentioned as sort of an afterthought. I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying there should be some hierarchy in who we think about as the beneficiaries of the technology at all, but I thought it was really interesting that my participants reflected on LGBTQ+ users or potential users of technology as actually the primary users of it. And so they came up with some ways in which the technology could be used that was really important. And participant 11 in my second focus group emphasized that this was really key. And the only way that these benefits will be realized is if, quote, at the get-go, we need to realize that folks assigned female at birth are not the only ones who will benefit or will need or want to have access to these services, end quote. So they're really saying that this technology is an opportunity to reframe it as not just a benefit to women, but also to specifically people from other marginalized communities in addition, which I think is really important. In terms of the benefits for potential users of technologies that were described by participants, these were really multifaceted. There was discussion of a range of values. Just before I get into these, I just want to throw out another example of a way in which a participant described what I think is quite a unique individual benefit of these technologies that I haven't seen much discussion about. And they were specifically talking about people who might experience dysphoria in pregnancy. So that includes trans people, but also people who would describe themselves as intersex or asexual, how pregnancy might be particularly difficult for them. So if they wanted to become a biological parent, it might be that this technology is really useful for them to build their families without having to go through dysphoric experiences. But also, by enabling another partner to gestate or by using ectogestation. They also talked about how they hope the technology isn't just treated as an alternative, but being trans and going through pregnancy, so trans men often have very unpleasant experience with healthcare professionals. And so they talked about this technology as being another way, somebody else gestating or a machine gestating as something that can really help people deal with that societal expectation. So in terms of the values that people mentioned, there was a lot of discussion about greater privacy and greater dignity in the process of reproduction. And at their root, I consider those values to be very closely linked to the idea of the technology having a quality enhancing capacity. So participants often describe privacy and dignity in decisions about reproduction as something that fertile heterosexual couples and people who can become pregnant often have as a matter of course, assuming that they don't need reproductive assistance. But for individuals who can't gestate, the journey to parenthood they describe as being marked by a kind of powerlessness and an invasiveness and can feel really dehumanizing. And they described how artificial placentas and uterus transplantation can address some of the negative emotional aspects of assisted reproduction for these individuals, meeting sort of social and emotional needs as well as affording them this privacy and dignity. So these are two examples of participants reflecting on these specific values. The first is an example of how privacy can be meaningfully afforded by these technologies. So specifically, they're reflecting on the fact that in surrogacy at the moment, you actually have to be really public about the fact that you're going through that process, both in a, telling your family and friends way, but also, telling your employer and your surrogate, informing people and so on and so forth. And so they describe that lack of privacy, something as quite invasive and something that's a cause of inequality. And I really like this second quote as well, where the participant says that there's a quiet dignity in being able to lead a life like anyone else leads without the noise and the hoo-ha. And so if you're able to gestate yourself or use a machine that doesn't involve the labor or bodily labor of another person, that affords you that quiet dignity and that privacy that means that you can reproduce in a way that sort of means that becoming a parent is less of a public decision for you and more of a private one that you make, in your family or whatever. So I think those values are really important. what I thought was really interesting is that if technology were able to assist individuals with these feelings, you know, in terms of how they become a biological parent without performing gestational labour, that can also better respect their sort of identity and that idea of identity formation that we really spoke to already. So it's equality enhancing because it's able to enable individuals to feel much less dehumanized and othered in the process of reproducing and becoming biological parents. The values, to me, that these values of privacy, dignity, and so on, that are infused within the way participants discuss assisted gestation, don't just reiterate that equality enhancing potential, but I think they really say something about the way in which we're discussing these technologies in the literature. I thought it was really interesting, and I did a double search to be sure after I sort of found myself coming to this observation. But not a single one of the participants talked about things like making a choice or autonomy or reproductive autonomy or those sorts of kinds of concepts. And I think obviously all of these ideas of privacy and dignity, they're all playing into that notion of reproductive autonomy, but none of them use the language that we're discussing these things in the bioethics literature. And to me, that says something about whether, when we talk about things like choice or autonomy, we're not really digging down in enough detail into articulating, you know, what the value of these novel technologies are to individuals, because the choice is great, but the choice really facilitates something else. And that is that privacy, that dignity, that sense of self, that ability to be yourself much earlier in your life in a broader structural sense. So I'm interested in digging into that a bit deeper. So now moved on to the second theme. We've finished reflecting on why these technologies are important. Next, the participants in both focus groups is a really predominant feature. There was a strong sense that discussion about why this technology was important also had to be accompanied with reflection about ways in which that potential was limited. So participant 9 here says that the potential equality benefits are really, they can be offset by who has the ability to access it and whether it's a technology that's actually available to anyone who wants to make use of it. And we are sort of starting to see, really since 2020, that the bioethics literature has started to move in this direction with assisted gestation as well. So you see increasing numbers of papers reflecting on, you know, why it's important that we talk about equality of access for uterus transplantation and ectogestation. But some of the barriers that my participants mentioned, I still are really, I think are really important to go through, because they aren't necessarily some of the ones that we're having conversations about, at least in the context of Great Britain. But just to say that for me, this is a really important observation, a really important part of the conversation, because sometimes it is too easy to get carried away with thinking about why technologies are good or why they're not, without thinking about some of the realities. And I think that this point of participant 9 really reflects Dorothy Roberts' observations that no matter what we think is coming, novel reproductive technologies are rarely as subversive as we think they're going to be, because they're controlled within dominant power structures, and a complex interplay of barriers limits who has access to them. And so I think it's really important to think about who's got limited access, you know, along the lines of things like class, race, socioeconomic status, and so on. In both focus groups, there was discussion about a range of barriers, so law, social barriers, economic barriers, and so on. What's really interesting to me as a lawyer is that participants all saw the extra legal obstructions to access as far more material. Like, they were less worried about what the law was going to say and more worried about everything sort of surrounding it, because they thought that would have a much greater impact. And this participant 9 again says that the law doesn't really just sit there by itself. There's all of this other stuff surrounding it that really makes far more of a difference in terms of who has access to care. So even if there were limited legal restrictions or no legal restrictions on access to uterus transplantation and artificial placentas, there was lots of concern about medical gatekeeping. And in particular, there was a conversation about this idea of need and want, and what is a need and what is a want, and the fact that medical professionals will often limit access to technologies on the basis of what is deemed a necessity and not allow access for things that are deemed a preference. So there were observations about what reasons are classed as need and what were classed as want, but there was a sort of firm feeling that that would be a dividing line, as the quote from participant 5 explains. There was a considerable reflection, which to me was really noticeable in both focus groups, about media villainization of particular uses of this technology. And there was a big focus within that discussion on the ways in which trans people wanting to access the technology might be framed as cause for concern, or a place where moral panic was played out in the popular press. Narratives otherizing individuals wanting to use assisted gestation would limit in reality who was able to access the technology and in what circumstances, and how choices were categorized both legally, socially, medically as meeting needs or preferences was likely to lead to the exclusion of socially infertile groups, in their opinion, as has consistently been the case. So, for example, you know, in the UK, it can often be really difficult for same-sex female couples to access IVF because artificial insemination is treated very much as an alternative. So, you know, if you really want assisted reproduction, you have that available to you. Those narratives were really talked about as a cause for concern. And the participants did a lot of discussion about the ways in which certain types of surrogacy were deemed socially acceptable and others weren't. And they saw that conversation as only intensifying and getting more extreme with these types of reproductive technologies available. In both focus groups, there was a consensus that clinical need was going to matter. And for that reason, we need to start thinking about how we frame that to be interpreted broadly to ensure access to both uterus transplantation and ectogestation. So some participants, like this very long quote at the top, they were very clear that clinical need mattered, but these technologies clearly have clinical need, and there's not really much of a debate to be had because it's very straightforward. So they talk about here, you know, somebody who wants to experience pregnancy, like there's obviously a psychological benefit, and they use that as an example of, you know, it's a simple question: am I helping this person when I help them use an artificial womb because their pregnancy is dangerous, or when, you know, they really want to experience a gestation. So they seem to think that's quite cut and dry, but they were challenged immediately after by another participant who said, well, actually, I think it could be way more complicated because, you know, I think what they're getting at is, even though they agree, who defines benefit comes to be a very big question. Like, what benefits suffice and what doesn't, and you know, what clinical benefits are clinical, and all that sort of thing. What's really interesting to me as an unclinically trained person is that even within this conversation here, challenging what counts as a clinical benefit is still a conversation that brings us back to quite medicalized thinking about things. You know, it's still a case of justifying why something is necessary, as opposed to thinking about why people want to experience different sorts of reproductions. Continuing on with this conversation, there was, you know, additional reflections on the fact that medical reasons are generally deemed more acceptable. But here we'd moved away from a will there be limited access to actually indirect barriers to access within people's social circles. So it's not just if your doctor says, you know, can you use an artificial placenta or not? It's what people around you are saying about your choice to do that. And there was a consensus there as well that explaining things in medical terms, almost, I mean, it wasn't talked about in this language, but it was an almost real sense that people are going to have to explain their reproductive technologies in ways that don't actually match their lived experience in order for that experience to be deemed socially acceptable to other people. So participant 1 in this quote below was talking about how when people often explain their choices around breastfeeding, they don't talk about it in terms of, you know, I wanted to do X or I wanted to do Y. They very much have to say that it was essential for me for these reasons, or I didn't have a choice, you know, for these reasons, in order to find social acceptability in some circles. Finally, on this point about medical perceptions of necessity and social perceptions of necessity co-constructing each other, there was lots of conversation about what would come to be a deserving user. And there was very much a sense that it's very easy for it to start going down this, what they describe as really bizarre, deserving, non-deserving, moral, immoral path. So different uses of this technology treated as a binary, you know, acceptable, unacceptable, depending on what kinds of people you're talking about and what their desires were. So this came up in this context very much about how sometimes it takes a particular type of story to sell a reproductive practice. So surrogacy, for example, at the moment is under quite a lot of heat in the UK. But stories about sisters carrying, you know, their sister's fetus for them, those stories tend to play out quite well because they have this sort of narrative of a deserving user and a sort of moral claim to that kind of discussion or that kind of choice. But there was concern that this might not go down so well in terms of uterus transplantation. And there were lots of different examples that the participants used, but in particular, they were again worried about the villainization of individuals who were already treated very badly in the popular press. This, just as a final note, I know I've talked a lot about this idea of clinical need and even social acceptability being seen as a clinical need question as well, but this is really key for me, and we need to start thinking about these questions now because we need to be attentive to social context, because I don't think these medical questions about what's acceptable and what's deemed valuable are separate from that context. And I think that these kinds of social conversations that are ongoing right now will have a significant impact in terms of realizing that equality enhancing potential of the technology. Let's do next. Okay, so the final and further barrier that I'm just going to discuss is realizing the equality enhancing potential of this technology is often very limited by financial circumstances. And this is not something that's gone unnoticed in the UTX and ectogestation place discussion. Issues of resource allocation came up and were very closely linked to those social conversations and ideas about clinical need and who pays for things, particularly because we were having this conversation in the context of Great Britain, where if something is clinical in the reproductive space, it will usually have some funding, even if it's not enough. And if it's not deemed clinical, it means that individuals have to pay for it through private channels. It's not on my slide, but there was a very long conversation in one focus group about how that is far more likely to fall on marginalized communities. So until very recently, there was not the same National Health Service funding for LGBTQ communities who wanted to access reproductive technologies. And so they were often going private, and they were subject to what some participants described as quite coercive policies, encouraging them to donate reproductive material in order for cheaper fertility treatment. And so there was a lot of conversation there about coercive practices potentially resulting where you don't cover the direct costs for individuals in a free at the point of access healthcare system. So there were conversations about direct costs, and those were deemed really inappropriate. But what I thought was far more meaningful was this interjection from a participant who talked about indirect costs. And what they were saying here was that despite the fact direct costs mean the most in terms of individuals deciding whether or not they can actually do something, you end up with these situations where people can't afford actually to engage in treatment from start to finish without it being at great personal cost to them. So this participant talked in a lot of details about, in their previous role, meeting with a lot of pregnant people who were consistently losing their 0-hour contract jobs because they needed to go to antenatal appointments that are scheduled in the middle of the day, or having to travel for particular appointments because they're accessing a treatment that was only done at particular clinics and so on. And so this participant was saying, well, actually, when it comes to these technologies, we need to start thinking beyond direct costs, because otherwise we're still going to end up with lots of marginalized communities who actually can't use these technologies because it puts so much pressure on, you know, their time and the flexibility that that requires of individuals. And that, to me, I think really speaks to some of these concerns that have been raised in the bioethics literature about direct costs. You know, this idea of rich people having machines that can gestate for them and poorer people not having those luxuries, or richer people being able to choose who gestates or how they gestate and poorer people can't. And I think those things go beyond direct costs, and they're really real risks in more ways than we've reflected on so far. So just a quick summary. I think novel forms of assisted gestation are potentially equality enhancing, or at least these results tell us that they are. And I really think the reflections of my participants bring some quite important nuance to ongoing conversations in the ethico-legal literature. And they've gone some way to explaining some of the potential needs of groups that aren't often considered, particularly LGBTQ plus individuals. And it's imperative that we think about more marginalized people when we think about these technologies, because if we don't take account of their needs now, as novel technologies and practices are developed and implemented, you know, we could end up with a situation where these individuals are permanently excluded. And so I think that these observations are really important to centre, as well as the political realities at hand, because that does allow us to see, you know, who's really impacted by these things. Just to say, I don't see these results as existing in a vacuum. I think that they're not a substitute for qualitative research with people who consider themselves potential service users, but I think they give us an indication of who we might want to talk to about what the benefits of these technologies are. And I also don't think they're a substitute for more thinking, digging down into some of these things, like why we're talking about dignity and privacy, and so on. So normative research is still really key for me going forward in this project. Just to acknowledge the organisations that participated, because they did give up their time and they gave me some really invaluable insights. As well, I just want to thank Anna Lewis at Harvard and Victoria Adkins at Greenwich, who read an earlier version of this and gave me some really useful comments. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what people think.